Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, support the podcast. Best way you can do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. I produce an analysis every week in written, audio, and video format, going through the most important events that's going on through the week. And I also organize Zoom calls with supporters only every week or two, where we shoot the breeze. You can donate, you can consult with me if you like through the website. Check out my affiliates and leave a podcast review. And I got a wonderful guest today. Joining us is Abhijit Chavda, who's a geopolitical analyst, podcaster, writer, scientist with a following of over 1 million across social media. He's the host of the Abhijit Chavda podcast and Ask Abhijit show, where he also interviews prominent thinkers. He was a speaker at the World Hindu Congress in 2023, held in Bangkok, and he has also represented India at the international level of the 2023 G20 proceedings and summit. He served as a peer reviewer for Physica Scripta, a major international scientific journal for theoretical and experimental physics. He's a member of the consultative group to the principal scientific advisor to the government of India. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Abhijit.
Thank you so much for having me here, Roy. It's really nice to be on your podcast.
Well, thanks for coming on. You know, I discovered your fascinating work recently. You're very successful as an Indian podcaster, geopolitical analyst, scientist, and so forth. And could you briefly introduce the audience to your podcast, the work that you do, and how you came to have such great success?
So my career has been really interesting. It's had lots of twists and turns. I have a background in theoretical physics. That's my professional background. But I've worked in the field of information technology for over a decade. There's that. And somehow during the lockdown period during COVID, I ventured into YouTube, and it worked out fine. So nowadays I'm a YouTuber. I have a podcast. I also have the Q&A show that I do on a weekly basis live. It's called the Ask Abhijit show. My forte is 3 different disciplines. It's science, it's geopolitics, and it's history as well. And I approach geopolitics from a multifaceted perspective. I take a look at the historical cycles, the historical precedents. I look at great power politics from the perspective of hard power, and so on. So I have my own analytical model that I use to understand geopolitics. I have a pretty good depth in history because I've been reading history since I was a kid. And I these days serve as an interpreter of geopolitics for the Indian audience, mainly thus far.
No, that's fascinating. COVID changed a lot for all of us. And, I would reckon for a large portion of Geopolitics and Empire listeners, India is unfamiliar territory. I've only had on a handful of Indian experts in the past, which include Dr. Jagannath Panda Surab Gupta and Shanmuganathan Nagasundaram. And maybe before getting your big picture view on the global state of play, I'd like to get a bit of a quick crash course on the current state of Indian geopolitics and geoeconomics. And maybe to start, if you could tell us, where does India fit on the grand chessboard, to use Brzezinski's term? Who are its friends, who are its enemies, and what would you say are some of India's strategic goals at the moment?
Yes. So India, if you look at it historically, if you look at the post-1947, post-independence India has not been a geopolitically ambitious nation. And there's reasons for it, because of the way the transfer of power happened in 1947. And the people who were running the country had very low ambitions and very low expectations. India, historically, if you look at the 20th century, if you look at the first Cold War period, then India was kind of, you could say, a non-aligned nation. At least technically, it was defined as a non-aligned nation, but it was kind of on the side of the USSR. It was kind of part of the Soviet bloc, and as such, the West created this bulwark against India, which was Pakistan, the proper Pakistan. And that's kind of the historical framing that Indians still look at the world from. That's the perspective they look at the world from. And we also had issues with China. China intruded into the Indosphere. They gobbled up Tibet in the 1950s, and the then Indian government did not do much to prevent that from happening. So, and then China took some Indian territory as well. So we have a historical border dispute with China. The India-Tibet border is not demarcated. So we have 2 major rivals. We have had these 2 major rivals in the post-1947 period, China and Pakistan. Now, Pakistan was very much pro-West. It was initially set up as a state that would take care of the interests of the British Empire, but the UK very rapidly became a second-grade world power, especially in the post 1956, post Suez Crisis era, and the US took over the reins of the empire. So the US became the superpower, the imperial power, and then Pakistan served as a proxy or an ally, or you could say a vassal of the US. China had its own ambitions. Uh, and from the 1980s, I mean, the Nixon Mao detente onwards, China also benefited from the opening up of the Western economy to its manufacturing. So China progressed very rapidly 1990s onwards, and India was kind of left behind. So that's the background scenario. Now, in the 21st century, until 2014 or so, India was an also ran kind of nation. India did not have any major geopolitical ambitions or such. But after the coming to power of Mr. Modi in 2014, things have changed, and especially these days, the past 5, 6, 7 years, India kind of matters to some extent. India obviously occupies a very important geographical position. It dominates the Indian Ocean region. It's the peninsula juts out all the way to the Indian Ocean, almost to the equator. So it's a very important geostrategic location. We dominate multiple choke points if we want to. The Malacca choke point, the Bab al Mandeb choke point, and the Strait of Hormuz choke point. So geographically, we are in a great position. Our economy is growing. It's the only major economy that is not going to have any chance of a recession. We are growing at 5, 6, 7%, whatever it is, the latest quarter upon quarter thing. But we are the only bright spot economically. Now we are entering this new period, this new phase of the new Cold War. The trade and tariff war has started just a week or two ago between the US and China. There's a decoupling, there's a bifurcation in process of the global order, and what we thought would be a multipolar world order would could very rapidly become a bipolar or tripolar world order. And where India fits into this is going to be very interesting. India would love to not have to ally or associate with any of these blocs, either the Western bloc or the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, whatever that axis is. India would like to be, like you say, either non-aligned or multi-aligned. We would like to be friends with everybody. We would like to be able to trade with everybody and so on. Will we be able to do that is a big question. Maybe somebody somewhere will probably ask us to make a choice. That's something we have to see. But India is right now, where does India stand in global geopolitics? I think India stands probably as kind of the leader of the global south. Not a very powerful nation, but still, I would say the fourth most powerful nation in the world. Definitely more powerful than all European nations individually, and India matters. And now with the decoupling that's happening, and there's going to be a small window of opportunity for India for. Becoming a manufacturing power. So economically, we have a GDP of about 4 point something trillion dollars, and a nation doesn't really matter until it reaches the $10 trillion mark. So that's a big aim, that's a big ambition, aspiration that the government of India has, Mr. Modi has, and the people of India have, to reach that $10 trillion mark as soon as possible. So that's kind of the context where we are. Who are our friends? We would like to be friends with everybody, but if you look at the world from a realistic perspective, our friends, we are on pretty good terms with the US. We are on pretty good terms with the European Union, with various Western nations. We are on good terms with the African nations, with the nations of Southeast Asia, with nations like Japan, the Eastern Asian nations. We have historically had excellent terms with the Russians, so we have a good relationship there. Who are our adversaries? Well, Pakistan, you could say, has historically been our adversary. It was a nation that was carved out of our own nation of India. We gave up our territory to create that nation, and it's always been a thorn in our flesh. It doesn't really matter these days, except for the fact that it's a nuclear power. And then the other big adversary is China. China is, if you look at it from a hard power perspective, they're about 3 to 4 times more powerful than India, and technologically way more advanced. So that's a challenge that India has. So India looks at the world from this perspective. Mainly, the main threat actually is China. China has historically sought to balkanize India. They've put out papers. Their generals have put out research papers and white papers advocating for the balkanization of India, and they have interfered in the internal affairs of India, especially in the eastern region. Tried to support various insurgencies, separatist tendencies against India, and so on. So China historically has been that sort of a player vis-a-vis India. These days, there seems to be some kind of a rapprochement between India and China to some extent. We'll see how far it goes. So that's kind of where India fits in the global grand chessboard, so to say.
No, that's a great breakdown, and it's a great foreign policy for India to have this to be non-aligned. I spent 3 or 4 years in Kazakhstan, and they have what they call a multi-vector foreign policy, where they want to be friends with everyone, which I think is the way to go. And I'm just curious further on that point. When you read the Western, the American geopolitical analysis, they sometimes give you a different picture. They want you to think, India is on the Western side, and I often see them sort of, as you say, straddling the wire between East and West, and it seems like Washington tries to pull them into their camp. I mean, do you see that going on? As you say, they try to, they're friendly with everyone, but do you sort of see Washington trying to pull India into its orbit?
Oh, very much so. We see that. We saw during the Ukraine war period, February 2022 onwards, they wanted India to participate in the sanctions against Russia. And they wanted India to stop buying any oil from Russia. And we did the opposite. We refused to participate in the sanctions against Russia. And we started buying even more oil from Russia. I think Russia could be probably one of our major, largest suppliers of oil right now, and we were getting oil at discounted prices. So we refused to bow to Western pressure to participate in the Western effort against Russia during that period. And today we have a situation where where the U.S. and Russia are kind of hopefully on the verge of some kind of ceasefire, some kind of agreement to end the Ukraine war. And if we had participated in the sanctions at that time, we would have looked stupid today. Because see, today our stand kind of is vindicated that there was no need to participate in the sanctions against Russia. So the West, especially the US, has always tried to pressurize India to toe a more US line on various things. And we have played the game. It's kind of a, like you say, tightrope walk. We do want excellent relations with them, with the US. We want to do trade, lots of trade with them. We would like to buy US weaponry as and when required. We are cautious about that because of various issues, because we have to sign various agreements that open up our airspace. And there's the question of kill switches and backdoors and whatnot, which is not a myth. The Australians have faced that. The FA-15s that they bought from the Americans, they turned out to be almost useless because they would not lock onto the targets the Australians wanted. So we are cautious when we buy in the question of buying US weapons. There's the question of the F-35 right now. The Trump administration would like us to buy F-35s. The last time Mr. Modi went to the US, just after President Trump's inauguration, so Mr. Trump put out a statement that the Indians will buy a bunch of F-35s from us. Well, I would say, let's be a little patient. We haven't agreed to that yet. So we would like to be friends with everybody. We would like to trade with everyone. We would like to be friends with everyone. We would like to have a mutually beneficial relationship with all actors in the world. We don't wish anyone harm. We don't wish to have the so-called that rise, the kind of rise that the Chinese have, the Chinese rise, the peaceful rise, which is not really very peaceful and which scares everyone. We're not that kind of nation. We're not going to turn up tomorrow at the UAE's doorstep with 25 warships. That's not the kind of thing we do. So I think India is a nation that's pretty I think it's a nation that people trust, that we don't have any malafide intentions, we don't have any nefarious objectives. We are a friend to everyone. But there is pressure on India, especially from the US, to toe their line.
You mentioned, you've answered a lot of my questions so far, but the economy, I think that's an interesting point. If you could tell us a bit more of how India is developing, I think just for India itself, but also for the world, its economic rise. I mean, it's great for India, and I think it would also benefit much of the world. And if you could just tell us a bit more about how you see that, what's going on in terms of the economic development there. You mentioned manufacturing. They are behind, as you say, when you compare to China and other places in terms of manufacturing and also tech. But how do you see that this trend and what's going on there?
Yes, it's a great window of opportunity right now for India to become a manufacturing power, but there are challenges. So right now, India's GDP is about 4 point something trillion dollars. If we divide it by the population of India, that's a very low GDP per capita. India's GDP per capita is comparable to various sub-Saharan African nations, actually. So historically we have not done well. We could have done much better. So India's economy is a growing economy. We are growing at 6.5, maybe 7%, sometimes 8% every some quarters, and so on. Now, India needs to become a manufacturing nation, a manufacturing power. With the decoupling of the East and West, especially China going out of the Western orbit, it's a great opportunity for India, and that could really boost job creation in India. Indians need jobs. We have a rising population. Every year, millions of new youngsters enter the job market. Who's gonna create those jobs? Manufacturing could create those jobs. So that's something India needs to look into. But there are certain problems that exist, structural and systemic problems within India that make it challenging for India to become a manufacturing power. There's over-regulation. There's a lot of red tape in India. There's over-bureaucratization. You need to take all kinds of permits and approvals and licenses just to start a business. The ease of doing business isn't great. I mean, ideally, if you have a great idea, then the nation should help you and unleash you on the world to try out your great idea. Whether it works or fails, it's a different matter. But that isn't there. It's pretty tough, and because of that, lots of Indians they want to leave the country. The education system isn't great. The quality of the population it depends on the quality of the education system, the kind of skills you have, the kind of approach you have to the world, the understanding of the world, and so on. So the education system isn't great, and it doesn't do a good job of equipping the Indian population with the tools you need to succeed, to be confident, and to succeed. So those issues do exist in India. And when it comes to manufacturing, look, if you go to China and you want to manufacture something, if you want to invest, let's say, $10 million in China, the Chinese government is gonna roll out the red carpet for you. They're gonna give you whatever you need, whatever permits, approvals. They will do the due diligence, obviously, but they'll give you all of that. You need land, they'll give you like 5 different options. Whatever quantity of land you need, they'll give you everything you need. It's really easy to set up a business in China. In India, it's the other way around. There are hurdles and obstacles at every imaginable step. It's much better than before. I assure you of that. It's way better than 10 years. It was 10 years ago. But there's still a lot of progress, a lot of work to be done when it comes to that. There are issues about contract enforcement as well. So because of this, India's manufacturing story hasn't quite taken off thus far. And for that to really happen, the government is going to need to do a lot of reformation. A lot of reforms will need to be done. If India does become an alternative to China in terms of manufacturing, it will be great for the world. The US is decoupling from China for a host of reasons. The first reason is there are multiple reasons, obviously, but the US historically aided and abetted the rise of China. They turned China into this technological superpower. China isn't comparable in military might to the US, but technologically they are almost up there. And there's only 2 nations right now that are neck to neck in the AI arms race. It's the US and China. The other nations, I don't even know if they're participating or not. So it's the US and China. And the Americans have brought China to that stage. So that's why the Americans, I'm sure, will be wary of India also growing beyond a certain level. They would not want to have another possible Chinese kind of entity 20-30 years down the line. But when it comes to lower technology manufacturing, I think it should be a great option for them. So I think there's a lot of potential for India's economy to contribute to the world. India has the manpower, India has the land, India has the talent. India has all the ingredients you would need for a nation to become a major manufacturing power. It just needs to get its act together and do the necessary reforms for this to happen. Yeah, but overall, if you look at the big picture, India is one of the few bright spots right now in the global economy. The only nation that has zero chance of recession. It's going to keep on growing. How fast it grows, how far it reaches, is a matter. It remains to be seen. But thus far, we're doing okay.
It reminds me just a bit of Mexico here, where I am, where we too could, be a powerhouse in our own right. Having number one or two in silver, energy, petroleum. But again, the many issues that keep us down: the corruption, the insecurity, cartels, and all that. Let me ask you about domestically, internally with India. For us outsiders looking in, what would you sort of relate to us would be most important? Obviously, you mentioned Narendra Modi. What's most important and interesting in terms of politics domestically within India?
Well, India is a genuine democracy. I mean, if you look at the US, all right, and let's compare India with the US. If you look at the US is a two-party state. The other political parties don't really matter. It's only the Democrats and the Republicans that matter. So it's a two-party system, which is just one step above a one-party system. That is North Korea and China. So that's what the US is. And if you look at the two political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, they essentially, usually, historically, have had the same foreign policy. So it's like a uniparty system, actually, the US. From outside, first of all, let me give my perspective. It looks like an autocracy masquerading as a democracy. Okay. Now, if you contrast that with India, India is an absolutely chaotic democracy. Hundreds of political parties. There are political parties for every cause, every little micro ethnic micro segment you can imagine. There are political parties for each religion, multiple political parties for each religion. Every state, we have states, like you have provinces, you also have states in the US. Yeah. So every state has multiple political parties and so on. It's absolute chaos from a certain perspective, but that's true democracy. So we have a real democracy out here in India, but there are only two political parties that really matter at the bigger at the national stage, which is the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, and the Indian National Congress, which has historically been the party that has ruled India for the majority of the time since 1947. And the Indian National Congress, its roots go back to the 19th century, and we'll not discuss that because it's not really important. So we have two major political parties, and it's the BJP that's in power. That's the party of Prime Minister Modi, and they have more internal democracy. If you look at it, I mean, in the US, you have the primary system, which means that both the political parties, they will have an internal democratic process that will throw up the next leader for the next presidential race, and at various other levels as well. So in India, I think the BJP is the only party, a political party, that has kind of that sort of system. It's not a primary system, but they have their own ways of checks and balances that ensures that the next leader comes up based on merit and performance, not based on political family connections or any such other considerations. You could not really say that of a lot of other political parties in India. So that's the political party that's in power in India. We have many regional parties that are important at the national stage because they end up affecting the balance of the seats and all that, the distribution when you have a national election. There are political parties in southern states, like Tamil Nadu. There's the DMK, AIDMK over there, and we have parties like the BJD, the Biju Janata Dal in Odisha, and so on. So we have a bunch of political parties that are regional and more linguistic in concept, because we have linguistic states in India, states based on the language people speak, and that's how the states have been carved out. So in Western India, there's a state called Gujarat, where everyone mostly speaks Gujarati. In the south, we have Tamil Nadu, where people mostly speak the Tamil language, and so on. You have states based on linguistic considerations, and then because of that, you have political parties that are linguistic based political parties, and they do affect the results of national elections. Some of these parties do, but overall, it's two parties. So who are the leaders when it comes to the Indian National Congress? It's Mr. Rahul Gandhi, who is the leader of the party, and he usually is the prime ministerial candidate of that political party. And within the BJP, we obviously have Mr. Modi, and there are various other leaders who who are doing very well at various levels, state levels and other levels, and so on. So it's a pretty interesting political system that we have. It's very different from anything you have in the Western Hemisphere. A genuinely chaotic democracy, but I think that's a true democracy. And I'm not sure if it's the best system for the country, because we have adopted the Westminster system that is an exact, almost exact copy of what you have in the UK. Now, the political system in the UK, first of all, they have a king or queen up top. We don't have that. We have something called the president, which is a kind of it's a it is a symbolic kind of a figure. Then we have a lower house and upper house of parliament, which is an exact copy of the British system. Instead of the House of Lords, we have something called the Rajya Sabha, and this system is kind of not the best system for a nation of India's size and magnitude, a subcontinent-sized nation. What would have been better would have been a presidential system along the lines of what you have in the US. But this is what we have today, and that's what makes India the kind of nation it is. It's not a very effective, efficient nation. There's a lot of inertia in India. Things take a lot of time to change. And yeah, in the 21st century, the nations that move the fastest, that are the most agile, are going to be the nations that rule the world. And that's why India could be left behind if certain reforms are not done. But yeah, that's the kind of political system we have.
And I fully agree with your assessment of my United States. It's basically a one-party system. And talking about perceptions, I was going through some of your recent material on your YouTube channel. Very highly recommend all your stuff. But I was listening to your interview with Ram Dwivedi, which I think he's Indian, but born or raised in France. And he works in a military. I think he teaches there at the military academy. And absolutely fascinating. Like I almost never do this, but I'm actually going to go back and listen to that again, because there was just so much stuff in there. And, you know, some of the things you guys discussed were perceptions. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on, you know, how Indians view America, the West, China, but also some of the perceptions coming out of the West as of late. And, you know, I don't know if you've noticed, but I've noticed in some of the socials, Telegram, X, because of this tense climate related to, you know, mass migration, there's been I see a bit of a resurgence of xenophobia in the West, more racist sentiment against Indians. You know, I grew up on the north side of Chicago, huge Indian population. I still remember in grade school, third grade, fourth grade, I had very good Indian neighbors and friends. I still remember the name Raul was one of my friends' names. I'd spent a lot of time at his home, and his parents always treated me well. And I think I read recently that some of the happiest countries in the world include both Mexico and India. But I've noticed this increasing negativity coming out of some portions of the population in the West. So just, you know, have you noticed that? Your thoughts on these perceptions from the West, and as well as, you know, how do Indians view the world?
Yeah, let's first of all tackle how Indians view the world. So for the longest time, you know, see, I grew up in the 20th century. I was born in 1976, and I grew up in the 80s, 90s, and I spent some of the time in the West. I spent some of it in Geneva, okay, as a kid growing up. So I saw both worlds. And when I came back to India, I was still a kid, and what I saw was incredible. So I realized that India was a completely closed off society at the time in the 1980s and 1990s. Until 1992 or something, India was completely closed off, just almost like North Korea. You had absolutely no idea, if you were in India, of what's happening outside the world, outside of India. There used to be one news channel, one TV channel, and there would be one news bulletin, one in Hindi, one in English in the evening, and all they would tell you is what was done by which minister or which politician today, and you had no idea of what was happening outside. So for the longest time, Indians were this isolated society. Then in the 1990s, things changed, and India opened up. And but that period of isolation kind of did shape India's worldview to a certain extent. Now today, how do Indians view the world is kind of different. Indians travel a lot, and we have a lot of exposure to what's happening in the world. I think the major countries, first of all, let's take the US. Uh, Most Indians have the greatest admiration for the US. Most Indians aspire to escape India and go and live in the US. So the best way to do that is to study and get good grades and then go and study there and get a green card or something, that sort of thing. That's the biggest aspiration Indians have. So most Indians, I think, admire the US. They admire the US for everything it has achieved, for being the greatest technological power, for being a nation that is the biggest, the superpower, and so on, for all the achievements, technological achievements and intellectual achievements and whatnot. So Indians really admire the US. But there's also this view that the US has not been very good to India, because now people do realize what happened in the 20th century. The US supported Pakistan, not just morally, but materially. So essentially, the US funded and financed Pakistani terrorism against India for a few decades. So Indians are beginning to realize that's what happened back then in the past. So that kind of clouds the relationship to a certain extent. But overall, I think it's a very positive view that Indians have of the US. Indians watch a lot of Hollywood movies and TV series and whatnot. So obviously that's going to have an effect. And the fact that most Indians, a lot of Indians are good at English. They speak English quite well, and that also helps. So the perception of the US overall is pretty positive, and the same would apply to a lot of European countries, despite the colonial history that we have with the UK. Uh, but most Indians don't really hold it against the British today. But when you have the West lecturing India, moralizing, sermonizing India and all that, that's when Indians like to call out that hypocrisy, especially in social media. When it comes to China, I think there's a pretty negative view of China from our perspective here in India. What they have done in Tibet, we see it as the occupation of an independent country, a country that was very close culturally to us, and they have completely sidicized it. And of course, the fact that the Chinese occupy some territory that was historically ours, and so on. So there is that. So there's a pretty negative view of China, and hopefully that changes. Hopefully, both nations can find a way to work together. It would be great if India and China could find a way to work together. That would be incredible. But yeah, the perception of China is kind of negative today from our perspective. Indians historically have had a very positive view of Russia, so there is that. And when it comes to nations like Japan, etc., we've had a pretty positive view of them as well. So overall, Indians have a pretty positive view of most nations, and that's how it is. Now, what you mentioned is interesting, that there's been a rise in xenophobia against Indians and against all foreigners these days in the West, especially in the US, because of a variety of reasons, and that's unfortunate. Indians, especially when it comes to Indians. I mean, if you look at any nation, you will find that Indians are one of the biggest source. India is one of the biggest sources of immigrants when it comes to any Western nation, whether it's the UK, whether it's the US, or it's Canada, or whatever. And you will find that if you look at crime statistics, Indians will consistently figure in the bottom 0.1% or something like that, bottom 1%. If you look at the ethnicities and nationalities of origin of the people who are incarcerated in the UK, in Canada, in the US, you will hardly ever see any Indians. So Indians are usually the most law abiding people. They never cause any trouble anywhere they go. They do their best to assimilate, and they're going to retain some of their cultural and national characteristics like everybody else does. So it's sad to see that there's been this rise in xenophobia against Indians, and I hope that this is just a passing phase. I remember about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a wave of attacks on Indian students in Australia. That thankfully was a passing phase, and there's none of that happening there today. So you know, things change. Times, certain things come and go. So maybe this is a period of time when, because India, I think the Western media also contributed to a certain extent to this, because when India refused to participate in American sanctions and American actions against Russia during the Ukraine war, then there was this outpouring of negative articles about India in the Western media, in the especially in the UK and in the US, the New York Times, the Guardian, the BBC, whatnot. And once the media does that, then it's going to have an effect on the way everybody perceives that nation. So that also, I think, contributed to a certain extent to that. But I think I hope it's a passing phase, and I would encourage Indians not to respond, because what's the point?
I'd agree with your assessment. From my experience in the U.S. around Indians, whether classmates or neighbors, very peaceful people in general. They assimilate. They're good at business, from what I see. And here in Mexico, it's funny. There's an increasing amount of Indians. Just like last week we were at a mall and I saw an Indian lady with her two children. And for me, it's interesting. Like, oh, look, it's Indian, because in Mexico you don't really see very many. It's mostly Mexicans. So to see any foreigner, it's like, oh wow, cool. Someone besides a Mexican. And let me ask you then about the global scenario. I often like to think that, I don't like to think, but I feel we're in almost like another 1930s moment. Ray Dalio, the billionaire, came out and said something to that extent. There's this talk, Graham Allison, among others, of the Thucydides trap. And I feel like we're in this phase transition again, that happens once in a lifetime, rise and fall of powers, changes in the international system. You mentioned bifurcation. Maybe you also follow. I follow many analysts, but there's Evelina Chakarova. I think she's Austrian. She's been talking about this dragon bear bifurcation. Javier Milei of Argentina just came out and straight out of Orwell, he said, Orwell talked about a future world of three blocks, right? Oceania, East Asia, Eurasia. Millet came out and said the world is going to be divided. This new world order is going to be divided into three zones, right? Russia, China, and the U.S. And so there's talk of multipolarity and BRICS, and talk of a third world war. And so all of these big topics and changes on the table. What do you see? Where are we, and where are we potentially headed?
Yeah, it's a very interesting time we're living in. I mean, there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades pass, and that's kind of the situation we are in. We are definitely maybe seeing a series of inflection points. There are certain points of no return. I mean, the US and the Chinese have completely are in the process of completely decoupling. Uh, uh, yeah, so I think the US. Some people would characterize the US as a power that's in decline. And a lot of analysts say that. I don't quite agree with that, first of all. I think the US has never been as powerful as it has been today. I think the US is at the pinnacle of its power. The US has military bases worldwide, more than 700 extraterritorial military bases in various parts of the world. So they have this excellent power projection capability. They can intervene militarily anywhere in the world at 60 minutes notice, more or less. There is that we have to consider. And then there's the emerging arms race in artificial intelligence. Intelligence could be a game changer, especially when coupled with robotics. We may take the human equation out of warfare entirely, and we may already be at that stage, perhaps. I mean, the real advances that happen in artificial intelligence are not going to be transmitted to the world. They're going to be kept under wraps. I mean, we have known that organizations like DARPA, they have kept things secrets for decades. I mean, the stealth bomber that was announced in the 1990s, they've been working on that since the 1970s or something. And there would be technologies that they have right now that they will not announce for the next 50 years, perhaps. So I think AI could be a transformative factor in the global arms race. I think right now there's only two candidates, two competitors. It's the US and China. And the US, I think, clearly has the advantage because they started long before the Chinese, and they have more capital to throw into that field. So that is going to be a big factor. Now, when it comes to the Thucydides trap, that's obviously the scenario when you have an established great power and a new power starts rising on the horizon, and then if that happens, then war is essentially inevitable. Uh, will that happen? I mean, it's only the US and China that could lead to that scenario of the Thucydides trap that was first described during the Peloponnesian War 2,500 years ago. I think by decoupling from China, they're going to ensure that China's economy doesn't rise too much, because the Chinese will no longer have access to the Western markets. So that's going to definitely curtail their economic growth to a significant extent. So China will not become a massive economic factor globally. Its rise will be capped more or less as wherever it is today. Obviously, President Xi Jinping is on a diplomatic tour right now of Southeast Asia and whatever else, and he's trying to make to build bridges and create perhaps a coalition against Western sanctions and Western tariffs. But let's see how far that goes. So I don't think there's gonna be. I hope there's no war between the U.S. and China. I think the only thing that could contribute, that could trigger a war between these two nations, is if the Chinese make a move on Taiwan. And I don't think the Chinese are in a position right now where they could be reasonably confident that they will capture Taiwan. And even if they do, it's going to be a hollow victory, because they'll inherit an island that's been essentially ruined. So yeah, there's a lot of change happening. There's definitely a bifurcation of the global order. Where India remains, where India is going to stand, will be known in the next 2-3 years. I would hope that India is a pole on its own. So maybe it'll be a tripolar world order. It'll be the US and its allies, Russia, China, and their allies, and maybe the global south. But is India powerful enough and strong enough and economically significant enough to make that happen? I'm not quite sure about that at this point in time. So yeah, we are witnessing a significant change in the world order. I think it's a technological arms race right now more than anything else. And the AI is it's not, see, any technology is a force multiplier. Initially we had sticks and stones, but then we had metal, and then we have other instruments like missiles and whatnot. But AI is not a force multiplier, it's a force exponentiator. And once any nation achieves that stage called artificial superintelligence, then it's essentially going to be game over. They'll rule for 1,000 years, perhaps. So yeah, that's the situation where we are at. So I think it's a two-horse race right now, the US and China. And it looks like, from my perspective, it looks like the US could win that.
Yeah, I recently had a guest echo your same sentiments, that whoever achieves primacy with this new technology can take over the world, essentially, as you sort of alluded to. And I was going to bring up, you had an interesting tweet the other day on X. You said phase 2 of U.S. military AI push is upon us. A more sophisticated integration of AI into U.S. military operations indicates that foundational AI systems have been successfully deployed, now being expanded. I assure you they dwarf the capabilities of ChatGPT, Gemini. Expect increased U.S. defense budget allocations for AI projects and accelerated U.S. competition in military AI capabilities. You were referencing NATO, I think, making advances in purchases there. And I've had on the podcast long ago, Washington think tank guy, author Michael Beckley. His thesis, he's posited that U.S. will remain the only superpower. And I see what, to what you're saying. I've been thinking a lot about this. This podcast was born out of just contemplation myself as an American of American empire. And I've had on a lot of the declinists, the late Johan Galtung. He's been on the podcast a couple times. He's talked about, he predicted to the year the Soviet collapse 10 years in advance. He's said 2025 is when U.S. would start to collapse. Maybe not. But decades have passed and the U.S. hasn't collapsed. So I definitely I can see your assessment being correct, that U.S. perhaps is at the pinnacle of its power. And just on Taiwan, it's interesting. I've been reading as of late a lot of the Pentagon sort of outlets saying China's going to take Taiwan. And maybe they want China, with your assessment, they would like China to do that because it would put maybe China in a weak position, because maybe they do want to start a war there. Just any thought on that?
Yes. So typically when you want to start a war, you want to have just causes for going to war. You need the right kind of trigger, the right kind of pretext. And the only pretext that would be justifiable from a US or Western perspective, was if China were to make a move on Taiwan, the kind of move that Russia made on Ukraine. Uh, and as long as China doesn't do that, they don't really have any reason, any good justification for going to war with China. Because I am pretty sure that if you look at the balance of power and all that, that if the US and China go to war, I hope it's not a nuclear war, but if it's a conventional war, the Chinese will not come out on top of that. The US has capabilities, very strong capabilities. And I mean, look, Taiwan is right offshore. It's right in China's backyard. It's been there for decades. And the Chinese still haven't been able to, retake Taiwan. That's how powerful the US is, even in China's own backyard. And they have those island chains, the first, second, third island chains, all the way to Guam. The Chinese have missiles that could obliterate Guam, possibly. That's what one hears. But overall, the kind of infrastructure the US has in the region, if you look at South Korea, if you look at Japan, those are like unsinkable aircraft carriers. And that could do a lot of damage to China. So if we look at a war scenario, I think I would see China coming out second best in that. And that's why perhaps there could be some elements in the US defense establishment that may possibly want a war with China. And I don't think it's a good idea, because that would be such a waste of so much work the Chinese have done. They've really worked their backsides off the past 4 or 5 decades and build up this entire economy, all this infrastructure, all this technology. And it would be a shame to see that being destroyed. But at the end of the day, that's how the world is, and wars happen. But I hope it doesn't happen. So, yeah, Taiwan is the only pretext the US could possibly have for going to war with China. And it makes sense for China not to make any moves on Taiwan. They are doing all those Dragon 25 exercises or whatever, encircling Taiwan and keeping the pressure on, quasi-blockading Taiwan. All that will continue. They'll keep on making a mockery of Taiwanese airspace. And it's going to be a new normal for Taiwan. This a very persistent and very heightened Chinese military activity all around that island. So that's going to be a new normal. That's going to continue. And whenever in the future the Chinese sense a genuine US weakness, they may make a move on Taiwan. But Taiwan isn't going anywhere. So there is no need for them to hurry, or no need to kind of push the thing. So that's the situation I see. I don't see the Chinese making a move on Taiwan right now.
And any thought on the EU? There's talk of it disintegrating, collapsing. As an EU citizen myself, I am not a fan at all of the EU. I view it as a technocratic, anti-democratic construct. But what do you see as important when it comes to the European Union?
So the way I see the EU is that it's first of all, I don't think any of the nations that are part of the EU are sovereign nations. And it's very simple. What's the basis of sovereignty? You control your currency. You have your own currency, which means you control your economy. Then you need to have complete control over your territorial integrity, which means you should control your borders, and you should control your armed forces. And you should control the kind of laws and policies are applied in your nation. And if you are a member of the EU, you neither have your own currency, you neither have any control over your borders, who comes in, goes out. You don't have control. If you're a member of NATO as well as the EU, then you have absolutely no control over your military. And if you're a member of the EU, then it's the bureaucrats in Brussels who gonna decide what policies will be implemented and so on. So if you are a member of the EU, of course, you will have the benefits of this free travel and all that. So it's great for individual citizens to a certain extent, but it's terrible for the nation states themselves. And obviously, then there's the question of immigration, because the EU is the bureaucrats in Brussels are forcing nations to accept large quantities of immigrants, only certain kinds of immigrants, military age males from certain regions, which is, I don't know what they're up to, but it's a disaster. So, that's where the EU is now. If we look at the past 3-4 years, what's going on in the EU, the Germany was the engine that drove the European economy. And for any economy to prosper and do well, you need large quantities of reasonably cheap energy. And all that was flowing in from Russia, and now that's been cut off. So the German engine is sputtering. And Germany went into a recession for a while. I'm not sure if it's still in recession, but it's not doing really well. And overall, Europe, the European economy isn't doing great, the way I see it. And now the European nations are raising the prospect of a potential uh, down the line some kind of conflict with Russia. I don't think Putin is crazy enough to start invading European countries, but they are already positioning Poland as the next in line when it comes to defending Europe from the a potential future Russian advance. So Poland is being strengthened militarily, and and the European nations, the EU nations, keep on insisting on keeping this war going. They are lionizing Zelensky. They are giving him the confidence to stand up to Trump, and they just want this war to keep on going. This ruinous war. When it comes to Ukraine, look, Ukraine has two options, in my opinion: either defeat Russia completely or end the war at any cost, because it's destroying the Ukrainian economy. It's destroying the demographics of Ukraine. It's been a complete disaster for Ukraine. So if you can't defeat Russia, then accept a ceasefire on whatever best terms you can find, and that should have been Zelensky's policy. But the EU nations are encouraging him to keep the fight going. They're even mustering up some money and arms and ammunition to keep the war going. So I don't know what they're up to, but it's not a good thing. The war should end, and that's in everybody's interest, in my opinion. Um, so now, if we consider a potential scenario, future scenario where Putin goes crazy, okay, he's a very sane man, but if, let's say, he goes crazy and he decides to invade Europe, will the European nations, will EU be able to resist a Russian advance? Do they have an arms industry of their own? Do they have the industries that you need to churn out tanks and fighter planes and arms and ammunition and howitzers and shells and whatnot? I don't think they have it. They're dependent on the US. They've outsourced their defense to the US for the longest time, and that's how they became welfare states, because they spent so little on defense. But now the Americans want them to spend more, and therein lies the conundrum for the EU. So overall, that's the situation the EU is in. It's becoming increasingly a less relevant geopolitical entity. Uh, I see the EU leadership doesn't really care about the citizens of the EU. That's how I see it. I don't know which masters they serve, but they certainly don't serve their own people. And I think I get the feeling, if we have this conversation again in 20 years, the EU will be way less relevant than it's today.
Yeah, I see that. I don't know what masters they serve either. And when you mentioned defense and, the U.S. discussing leaving NATO command, which they've had since its inception, I view one of the plays as well as they want to create an EU army, and which I think has always been part of the plan, because, from its inception, you're creating this supranational globalist construct, regional union. Or, I have with me a few Croatian kuna. 3 years ago, Croatia lost its currency. And I felt like that was the death of my nation right there.
Yes.
And if you're going to have, throw 30 nations into one, you're going to have one political system, ECB, one economic system. You need to have one military. And I think that's what they're trying to do with the pretext of the Ukraine war. And you mentioned, who are these masters that are served? I wanted to get a little conspiratorial with you. Just last night I was notified that you've got many of these podcasts, different platforms and services, and there are these different lists, and the top 100 best conspiracy podcasts, Geopolitics and Empire was number 38 ranked. And I'm just curious, venturing a bit into this territory of parapolitics, deep state globalism. And many years ago, I interviewed Peter Dale Scott, who's in his 90s now. And he's one of the fathers of the study of deep politics, and that term came about, I think, from the 90s, when in Turkey, you may be familiar, where there was this car crash, and they discovered in the car crash, gangster or mafia criminals, and then a Turkish military general and politician, and it's like, what are they all doing together? And then you get, and I think most countries have their own form of a deep state. But I also think there are a transnational class that has its own agenda. One of those I see as, world government. I mean, this has openly been talked, from Cecil Rhodes, you talk about the British and many others. And we see we talked about Trump in the US, they're openly discussing integration of Canada, USA, and Mexico. Even the Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, the former president, has said, we need to copy the EU and create a North American Union. I have mainstream sources that show Bukele of El Salvador has said the same. He said we need to copy the EU and create a Central American Union. And so I don't know how much you've treated this space on your broadcast, but any thoughts when it comes to some of these ideas of how the world works?
Yes, well, for the longest time we had this period of globalization. Now it looks like we are deglobalizing, but looks like Trump wants to annex Canada, Mexico, and even Greenland. So that would create a much larger entity. When it comes to the deep state, Trump made lots of references to the deep state while he was campaigning. And when he was speaking about the deep state, when he was referring to the deep state, he was talking about the bureaucracy. So he was saying that we're gonna, deal with the bureaucracy. It's a really bloated bureaucracy. They are eating up all our budget, and we're gonna trim the fat and make it a leaner, meaner machine. And that's what Doge essentially is. They're gonna make it a more streamlined bureaucracy, which will be even more effective. And they're gonna let go a lot of people who are just eating up the money. So that's not really what I would consider to be the US deep state. From my perspective, look, I don't know if a deep state exists or not, but I get the sense that it does. And what would this actual deep state be? It would be an extra political, extra electoral entity, extra electoral center of power. Very small number of people who actually hold all the power. And it doesn't matter whether there's an election or not, because they are not elected. I think every nation has such a grouping of people to some extent. The ultra rich, especially the people from old money, the ones who have been controlling things for generations. Such families do exist in most nations. And when it comes to the US, it's not a very old nation. It's a nation that was artificially created not a very long time ago, from my perspective, because we are a very old civilization. So it's a nation that was born from that was created by people who came from Europe, from the UK essentially. And there's going to be linkages, family linkages and things. And maybe there are some possible linkages between the US and Europe and other nations that have been settled by Europeans. And maybe there's a small group of people who perhaps control a lot of what goes on there. That's obviously pure speculation. I have no evidence to back that up. There have been books written about that. There's talk of, well, there are certain facts about the U.S. Central Reserve, the Federal Reserve, for example, the fact that no one knows who are the shareholders, who actually runs it, and there are big questions when it comes to the U.S. when about these things. So it looks like there could be something called the deep state, and maybe they feel that at some point in time they should create a one world government, which would be terrible for the citizens of the world, but it will be great for the people who are in power. It's obviously all speculation. We don't have any evidence to back it up. But if you think about it logically, it makes sense that something like that could or possibly would exist.
Let me ask you about, something that I think about a lot is this, you mentioned AI, this momentum that's building for digitizing everything, the technocracy now. I think in your interview with Ram Dibedi, he mentioned technocracy and algocracy, rule by AI, government run by algorithm. And we see many countries now bringing in digital identification. They're openly saying they want cashless systems. Out there in India, I read about the Aadhaar system, and many of these countries are stipulating, Tony Blair is now out on the scene. He's got his institute. Just this week, he's pushing hard. His senior advisor at the institute said, "Oh, digital ID is not about government control." And I'm thinking, in 2021, I was trying to grow this podcast. Patreon bans me. The Department from Homeland Security in my own government that I pay taxes to in 2022, the same week that the DHS rolls out the Disinformation Governance Board, myself and two other outlets get banned from PayPal. So it's clear that, the Department of Homeland Security tells PayPal, hey, cut these guys. And so if we're entering into this sort of technocracy, my fear is with digital IDs, like you have the Aadhaar system, you will have to ask permission to do anything, whether it's a public or private activity, buying food or government identifications. I know Aadhaar has had many problems, but how much have you looked at this trend, and do you sort of fear us moving into a dystopia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it depends on to what level you implement these things. When it comes to India, we have something called UPI, Unified Payments Interface, that allows you to pay any amount of money to for any service or goods at anywhere in the country. It takes just a couple of seconds to do it, and it's really made life a lot easier for a lot of people. It's brought a lot of the informal economy, the cash-based economy, into the formalized system, and it's been great for a lot of people. It's very convenient. It's brought in a lot of convenience. You don't have to carry cash anymore. So that has been great for India. But when it comes to making everything digital, your identity digital, and so on, that actually could be very problematic, because it puts a tremendous amount of power in the hands of a very small number of people who control the entire system. Because when you have a system like this, you only need a few people to control it, and they can essentially they can play God if they wish to. Um, and when you have nations like the US, where the systems are way more sophisticated, it can really create a dystopia. For example, if you remember, during the time when Justin Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada, there were the trucker protests, and Justin Trudeau he froze everyone's bank account. I mean, that's completely, I'm sure it's illegal and unconstitutional, but he did that. So it was so easy for the government of Canada to shut down the truckers' protest by freezing everyone's bank accounts and that sort of thing. So if you have that sort of power, it could induce people to become despotic, especially when you already have someone like Justin Trudeau who has despotic and tyrannical tendencies. So I think it's pretty dangerous. I think in one way it's nice to move away from cash. You no longer have to carry cash because you don't get robbed. There's no chance of getting robbed and so on. But it opens up a whole other set of problems. And when you digitize everything, when you digitize a passport, you digitize your driver's license, your phone number, you tie everything with your bank records, with your whatever else, it gives a tremendous amount of control over your entire life in the hands of government. And I don't think that's something that's desirable. I think human beings need to have a certain amount of autonomy and freedom, and I don't think governments can be trusted to always do the right thing for the citizens. So I think it's a dangerous territory we are entering, but that's where technology has brought us today.
Yeah, I'd agree. But, before I continue, are there any sort of other issues, because you cover a wide range of topics, or maybe at this very moment, what else is most interesting for you on the grand chessboard, current developments or things on the horizon?
One thing that I find really interesting is the space race. So space is obviously the next frontier, and there's only one country right now that is capable of right now sending a mission to Mars. So there's a Mars transfer window that opens up every 26 or so months because of the way the orbits of the planets are aligned, and I think Elon Musk is almost there with his Starship, and I think by the 2030s, by 2030, 31 or so, we're going to have the first landings on Mars. And that means that by 2050, there could be possibly a significant population of human beings on Mars, all of whom will go there via SpaceX rockets, which means that the US could end up very quickly colonizing Mars, and they could end up owning Mars. And the same could happen with the moon. So we have NASA planning to go to the moon in the next 2 or 3 years, sending astronauts once again. So we are now entering that phase where we are actually going to colonize other solar system objects. It'll start with Mars and the moon, and I think if other countries don't participate in this race, they're going to be left behind, far behind. And I think that the 2 or 3 nations that will be at the forefront of the space race in this century are the 2 or 3 nations that will rule the world. So I think the space race is something that, because of this tariff war that's going on right now, and the the developments in the AI. Every week there's something new that's coming up. We are not quite looking at the space race, and the space race, I think, is very important, and it's going to be very consequential for the long term future of humanity.
And what about energy? That's an interesting topic. What is interesting for you there? It seems like, well, bringing online a lot of these AI data centers, they just require a mass amount of energy. India, how is India in terms of energy, and what do you see important when it comes to that?
Yes, energy is super important, and energy is becoming a genuine bottleneck in the progress and development of AI. Because AI systems, I mean, if you have these gigantic server farms on which you run all this compute, they're going to need a tremendous amount of water for cooling and a tremendous amount of energy for running the servers. And we will soon reach a phase where the amount of energy a country can generate and sustain is going to be a bottleneck. So the US is already ramping up its energy infrastructure because of this, and the same could soon be witnessed in China and other nations that decide to participate in the AI race. So energy is going to be a hugely important commodity and a very valuable commodity in the years to come. When it comes to India, uh, we are not an energy self-sufficient nation. We generate produce about 59% or so, the last time I checked, of our own energy. So about 41% of our energy has to be imported. Most of that is oil and gas. So we get it from various sources: the Gulf region, Russia, other nations, Oman, Qatar, whatever. That's oil and gas, and we are prioritizing increasingly we are increasingly prioritizing renewable energy. So we have a lot of sunlight in India, and we could set up a tremendous quantity of solar farms and all that. So that's already a work in progress. So there is that, and nuclear energy as well. But overall, I think energy is going to be interesting, because right now we rely on lithium ion batteries, and lithium is a very in demand product right now. And whoever has lots of lithium resources is in a great position globally, geopolitically. In India also, we have discovered large deposits of lithium. But lithium, eventually the question is going to be, what do we do with all the batteries? So once a battery gets completely depleted, you cannot recharge it. You're going to have to discard it somewhere, and that's going to create a lot of pollution. So an alternative could be, instead of lithium, you use sodium. So you use sodium ion batteries. So that's a technology that's not really been developed thus far very seriously, but that could be a good alternative. So maybe there could be research on sodium ion batteries going forward. And sodium is very plentiful. It's a component of salt all over the oceans. You find it. So it should not be that difficult to procure large quantities of sodium for that. But yeah, that's still kind of speculative, because theoretically it can work, and I'm sure there's some research that's been done, but thus far we're all going all in on lithium.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I didn't want to get some tips from you on because you've been very successful. You cover a lot of information on your program, whether with your interviews with prominent thinkers or just your weekly program. Do you have any tips on when it comes to how to parse, how to find information, how to wade through, propaganda, good and bad information from all sides, and how to sort of, do some proper and good research?
I think finding the right information is a full-time occupation. There's so much information out there. Much of it is noise, with all this chatter on social media and all, but social media still is one of the best sources of real-time information. So the way I do it is, I look at some of the so-called legacy media outlets, the BBC, the New York Times, all of that. And every country has a set of those outlets. In India, we have the Times of India, the Indian Express, and a few other such outlets. So you got to monitor all these every day if you want to stay abreast of what's happening, and also look at what's happening on social media, what the sentiment is like. So if you really, I mean, from my perspective, if I want to know what's happening, it's kind of a full-time activity. You have to keep on checking what happens. It's very hard to find high quality, good information. And how do you tell right from wrong, what is propaganda, what's not. I think it's just instinct. After a while, after a few years, you develop the instinct of what the truth is about. You kind of get a sense of what each outlet is going to report, what the reporting style is like, and what their subtle or not so subtle biases are. So based on that, you can make an informed judgment. So it's something you gain, you learn through experience, you learn through through wading through lots of data, so you develop your own intuition. But yeah, it's the most challenging thing, finding the right information in today's world.
Yeah, and I think it's important. I try to read everything, even from, let's say, propaganda outlets. You read between the lines, BBC,
Yes.
CNN, and RT, Russia Today, Sputnik, China Global Times, Press, Iran, Press TV, conspiracy stuff, books, interviews with diplomats. You name it, and then you put that all into the pot. And I guess each of us can formulate our own
Yes.
algorithms or formulas. Given some of the turbulent times that we live in and the things that we discussed, do you have any just tips for or advice for people wanting to survive and thrive? For individuals to successfully sort of navigate these times, or even tips for people who want to create content, whether it's podcasting or other formats.
I think in today's day and age, I think skills are very important. Not quite so education and degrees. You need to know how to learn, because the world is changing so rapidly, and new skills are gonna be more relevant in a few years because of AI taking over. So I think it's very important to be agile, to be flexible, to learn, to know how to learn new things very as rapidly as possible. If you are a programmer, you kind of used to it, because new languages come in and you got to learn those new languages and stuff like that. So I think it's very important to always be able to acquire new skills in today's world. And it's going to be an uncertain time going forward. The world that we were used to no longer exists, essentially. For example, if you are in the EU, if you are a member of the if you are a citizen of the EU, your country could buy cheap energy from Russia. It could trade with China, access to Chinese manufacturing in the Chinese market, and at the same time benefit from US protection, military protection. Now that may no longer be the case. You no longer have access to Russian energy. You no longer have access to the Chinese markets. You can't have things manufactured in China. And the US is putting big conditions on the military support they may or may not give you. So it's a really uncertain world. And how do you navigate that? How do you survive and thrive in that? That's a big open question. I think we have to go back to the time when you had World War like situations. How did people survive? How did people deal with the situation? And maybe falling back on that historical memory and how people were able to deal with those situations, you could learn something from that, perhaps.
One of my final questions is about visiting India. I've never been to India. I've got some Mexican friends that have gone recently, and they travel to India. And we have had, again, some of these scare stories about women who've been to India or assaulted, but just is it safe to visit India? What are your thoughts about tourism and message to foreigners about coming to India?
Okay, great question. Look, India is safe as long as you take the right precautions that you would take in any country. Does it make sense for, let's say, if you are a woman, does it make sense for you to walk around in, let's say, Brooklyn in New York past a certain time at night? I don't think it makes a lot of sense. You have to take common sense precautions anywhere you travel. If you take those common sense precautions in India, you'll be fine. Don't if it's your first time in India, don't go off the beaten track. Go to the popular tourist destinations, have a sense of the culture, enjoy whatever you want to enjoy, whatever you like, whether it's adventure tourism or cultural tourism or whatever it is. Don't go off the beaten track the first time you go to India. Stay safe. Take all the precautions you can. Have somebody to guide you if possible. Hire someone. There's a lot of tour agencies and whatnot. And once you get a sense of the country, you can be a little more adventurous. Overall, it's a very safe country. Most people are really welcoming, really friendly. Every country has its peculiarities. If you are a person with white skin in India, and if you travel to some parts of India, people will find it very strange that you have white skin, and they may want to take selfies with you, and you may find it strange. But most likely, they will not do you any harm. They'll just be curious about you. So you need to do some prep work, some research about what kind of country it is, what kind of cultural peculiarities it may have that you may not be accustomed to, and plan out your itinerary. Let's say it's a 5-day thing, and plan out each stage of your 5-day visit to India. So if you take those precautions, you're going to have a great time. But if you are careless, well, please don't be careless. That's what I would say. And that applies to me as well in India. You've got to take precautions. Any country.
Hopefully, one day I get to visit India. Well, we've covered the waterfront. This has been a great crash course. By the way, I listened this week to a few years back, you interviewed Edward Lutwak, and I have him scheduled for later today. So that was fascinating. All of your links are in the description, but where are the best, what are your current projects that we should know about, and where are the best places to follow you?
The best place to follow me is on YouTube. My current projects are I'm doing geopolitical analysis. I am doing this weekend live stream that I do every weekend, in which I answer questions more or less live from the audience. And there's this project called Understanding America, in which I'm going to wade through 100 books written by Americans about America. It's a long-term project, and get a better sense of what the nation is like and how it was formed and all that. So it's a long-term project that I'm working on. So the best place to see me is either on YouTube or on X, mostly. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Those links are in the description. I encourage people to follow you on X, to subscribe to your YouTube. And again, thank you for your time and for coming on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you so much for having me.